quite like Forrest Gump. More than 3 decades after its release, people still quote its lines, visit its filming locations, and swap stories about how it was made. But underneath the box office success and the Oscar wins, there's a mountain of behind-the-scenes trivia that most fans have never heard, including one genuine on-set accident that ended up becoming the most quoted line in the entire movie. Stick around, because by the end of this list you'll never watch this film the same way again. Gary Sinise's portrayal of Lieutenant Dan is one of the most talked-about performances in the film, and a huge part of that came down to a visual trick that was ahead of its time. Sinise didn't lose his legs, obviously. He wore blue coverings over his lower legs while seated in a wheelchair, and the effects crew painted over that section of every frame to make it look like there was nothing there at all. It sounds simple by today's standards, but in the early 1990s, this kind of digital erasing was still experimental. The result was so convincing that audiences never questioned it, and it let Sinise's performance carry the emotional weight of a man who has lost not just his legs, but his entire sense of purpose. His slow transformation from an angry, broken veteran to someone who finally makes peace with his life is often cited as one of the most affecting arcs in the movie, and none of it would have landed the same way without that seamless effect work. One of the film's cleverest historical gags involves a young Elvis Presley staying at Forrest's boarding house and picking up his now famous hip-swiveling dance moves from watching Forrest. The actor who physically played Elvis in that scene was Peter Dobson, but the voice audiences heard wasn't his. It actually belonged to Kurt Russell, who had played Elvis himself years earlier in a television biopic. Russell went back into the studio and recorded new lines that were dubbed over Dobson's performance, and the swap was kept quiet for well over a decade. It wasn't until Russell discussed it publicly, more than 10 years after the film hit theaters, that fans found out the truth, that the director had asked him to step in because the original vocal take just wasn't working. What makes it even stranger is that Russell hadn't voiced Elvis in his own biopic. A singer had handled those vocals instead. So in a strange twist, Russell's most famous performance as Elvis's voice ended up being in a completely different movie. Forrest Gump loves to drop its main character into the middle of real historical events, and one of the boldest examples is Forrest's trip to the White House to meet President Kennedy after being named to a college All-America team. It's a charming scene, but it doesn't line up with the actual timeline. The real All-America team for that season wasn't announced until after Kennedy had already been assassinated, meaning the meeting shown in the film simply could not have taken place the way it's depicted. Of course, historical accuracy was never really the point. The scene exists to reinforce the film's whole thesis. An ordinary, unassuming man who somehow keeps finding himself at the center of major moments in American history. The filmmakers weren't trying to write a documentary, they were building a fable, and a little bit of timeline bending was part of the charm. The park bench where Forrest sits and tells his life story to strangers is arguably one of the most iconic props in movie history, even though it's just a plain bench. It was set up in a square in Savannah, Georgia, and the crew even had local police temporarily reroute traffic so they could film the bus pickup scenes properly. 4 identical benches were built for production, since a single prop wouldn't have survived the demands of a shoot with so many takes and different angles. After filming wrapped, one of those benches was donated to a local museum, where it remains on display today, though visitors aren't allowed to actually sit on it anymore, since it's protected behind a barrier. The other 3 benches have essentially vanished into private collections, changing hands the way other famous movie props have, and their current locations aren't publicly known. During Forrest's legendary run across the country, he passes a small-town storefront just as a news broadcast mentions that President Jimmy Carter has collapsed from heat exhaustion. It's a nice little historical touchstone, except for one problem. The timeline doesn't actually work. Forrest is shown beginning his run in the mid-1970s, before Carter had even taken office, which means he couldn't have heard news report about a sitting president who wasn't president yet at that point in the story. It's another example of the film playing loose with dates in order to stitch Forrest's fictional life into real historical moments, prioritizing emotional and narrative rhythm over strict accuracy. Tom Hanks has spoken candidly about just how physically brutal filming the cross-country running sequences actually was. This wasn't a case of shooting a single afternoon of jogging. The production had to travel to numerous locations scattered across the country to capture the different landscapes Forrest runs through. Hanks described nearly a month of non-stop travel, where he'd put on the costume, run for hours in one location, then immediately fly out to the next spot to do it all over again. By the time the crew got around to shooting the heavily dialogue-driven bench scenes, arguably some of the most important scenes in the entire film, Hanks was running on fumes. Remarkably, those scenes, despite being some of the most talked-about moments in the movie, were filmed in less than 2 days, all while Hanks was completely drained from weeks of physical exertion. Getting Forrest's voice right was crucial to the character, and instead of working purely with a dialect coach, Hanks took a more unusual approach. He studied the natural Southern accent of Michael Connor Humphreys, the young actor cast to play Forrest as a child. Humphreys, who really was from Mississippi, had a genuine, unforced drawl that Hanks worked to replicate so that the character sounded consistent whether he was 6 years old or fully grown. The strategy paid off in a big way. Hanks earned an Academy Award for his performance, while young Humphreys picked up his own recognition for helping establish the character's voice in the first place. Rather than take a conventional upfront salary, Hanks negotiated a deal where he'd earn a percentage of the film's profits instead. It was a gamble. Nobody involved with the production knew for certain that the film would become the phenomenon it did, but it mirrored the kind of instinctive, almost accidental good fortune that defines Forrest's character throughout the story. When a film went on to pull in hundreds of millions of dollars worldwide, that decision turned out to be one of the smartest moves of Hanks's career, reportedly netting him tens of millions of dollars, far beyond what a standard salary would have paid. Michael T. Williamson's portrayal of Bubba is one of the film's most beloved supporting performances, complete with his soft voice and one-track obsession with shrimp. But the exaggerated shape of his lower lip wasn't natural. It was a carefully designed prosthetic piece. The makeup team spent considerable time refining it so that it would sit naturally on Williamson's face without looking obviously fake, and it worked well enough that plenty of viewers had no idea it was an effect at all. It's a small detail, but it's a good reminder of how much unseen craftsmanship goes into even minor characters. After the movie became a hit, the fictional shrimping business that Forrest builds in Bubba's memory eventually inspired an actual restaurant chain. It opened its first location in California in the mid-1990s and has since expanded into dozens of locations around the world, complete with movie memorabilia and a theme built entirely around the film. In one of those strange real-life coincidences, a then-unknown Chris Pratt was reportedly working at one of these restaurants years before he became a household name in Hollywood, and his personality on the job is said to have caught the attention of someone who helped kickstart his acting career. The scenes depicting Forrest's time fighting in Vietnam weren't filmed anywhere near Southeast Asia. They were shot on a golf course and surrounding coastal land in South Carolina. To transform the setting, the production brought in extra tropical foliage and relied heavily on visual effects to create the dense, overgrown jungle look the story required. It's a good example of how much illusion goes into recreating a believable war zone on a domestic budget and schedule. The film places Forrest at the University of Alabama during one of the defining moments of the civil rights era, when the state's governor tried to physically block 2 black students from enrolling. In reality, federal intervention forced the governor to step aside, allowing the students to enroll under protection. The film's version compresses and dramatizes the event, but the core facts, the governor's public defiance and the federal government's response, are rooted in real history, giving this particular sequence more historical weight than most of Forrest's other encounters with the past. Early drafts of the film reportedly leaned into a far more uncomfortable piece of military history: the practice of grouping soldiers with lower cognitive test scores into the same units during the Vietnam War era. The initial concept would have shown Forrest and Bubba's entire platoon made up of similarly characterized soldiers, but concerns from military consultants led to a revision, ultimately limiting that characterization to just the 2 of them while depicting the rest of the platoon as ordinary soldiers. Despite the creative liberties taken elsewhere in the film, military historians have actually praised its portrayal of certain wartime realities, including ambush tactics and the physical conditions soldiers faced, even while acknowledging that the film overall treats the war with a much lighter touch than its true grim, prolonged nature deserved. In the scene where young Forrest boards the school bus for the first time and gets turned away by two other children before Jenny offers him a seat, those two rejecting kids weren't hired actors. They were the real-life children of the film's director and its lead star. It's a small detail, but it adds a layer of behind-the-scenes trivia to one of the movie's most tender moments, the beginning of the friendship between Forrest and Jenny that carries through the entire story, despite the hardship and instability in Jenny's own home life. Tom Hanks wasn't the studio's first choice for Forrest. Several other well-known actors were approached first and turned the role down, with at least one later admitting regret over the decision once the film became a cultural phenomenon. The casting search for Bubba, Jenny, and even Lieutenant Dan tells a similar story. Multiple respected actors were considered or offered those parts before the roles ultimately went to the cast audiences know today, several of whom went on to receive major award nominations for their performances. The extended running sequence, one of the most memorable segments in the film, almost didn't make the final cut because the studio balked at its cost. The director felt strongly that it needed to stay in the movie, so he and Hanks reportedly agreed to personally cover part of the expense themselves in exchange for a bigger cut of the film's future profits. It turned into one of the most iconic segments of the entire movie, complete with strangers joining Forrest's cross-country jog and adopting slogans that became genuine pop culture merchandise. Despite how effortless it looks, the drifting feather that opens and closes the film wasn't a digital creation. The crew filmed a real feather against a blue screen for multiple takes and combined the best moments to create that smooth, weightless motion. It's a subtle piece of practical filmmaking hiding in plain sight, and it reinforces the film's central metaphor about how much of life is shaped by pure chance. While filming the demanding football sequences that show off Forrest's athletic talent, Hanks was reportedly dealing with a bad case of the flu. Running full sprints across the field over and over while feeling physically ill made an already tough shoot even harder. But the final footage doesn't betray any of that struggle, a small testament to Hanks's commitment to the role. Most people don't realize a sequel was genuinely in development at one point, loosely based on a follow-up novel. The concept took a strange meta-turn, with Forrest reacting to the existence of a movie made about his own life and grumbling about its inaccuracies. In this version, Forrest's shrimp business has collapsed, leaving him broke and working an unglamorous job, before a series of new misadventures pulls him back into the spotlight. The project never made it past early development, and today it exists as little more than an intriguing footnote in the film's history. And now, the moment we've been building to, the accidental line that became the most famous phrase in the entire movie. When Forrest introduces himself early in the film, the words, "My name is Forrest Gump, people call me Forrest Gump," weren't written in the original script at all. Hanks reportedly improvised it on the spot during filming, and rather than cutting the moment or reshooting it, the filmmakers kept it in. That unplanned ad-lib ended up becoming one of the most recognizable lines in modern film, repeated endlessly by fans and referenced in countless parodies and tributes over the years. It's a perfect example of how a small, unscripted mistake can end up defining a character more than anything written on the page. Proof that sometimes the best moments in filmmaking happen entirely by accident. Forrest Gump remains a film built on contradictions, a story that bends history for the sake of emotion, a production full of physical hardship hidden behind a warm and gentle tone, and a legacy shaped as much by happy accidents as by careful planning. Decades later, it's still one of those rare movies where every rewatch seems to reveal something new. If any of these details surprise you, there's a good chance there's an entire second list of trivia just waiting to be told.